Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Following Lorelei, I am the Assistant Director of Public Health. I've worked really closely with Lorelei in the planning process, so hearing her talk is always a pleasure. And following her, as we look into new and novel industries, with that comes, communities and industries, questions and concerns, especially when they're novel and there's not a lot to go off of. Just this week, the American Lung Association released their 2023 State of the Air report, and that report found that Bakersfield has the worst rate of short-term particulate pollution and annual average particulate pollution, both of which are measured at PM 2.5, as Lorelei mentioned, in the nation. In addition, we're in the top 5 for ozone pollution. We know that poor air quality has been linked to a host of health problems, including an increase in the severity of asthma attacks and associated hospitalizations in children. We also know that Kern County continues to be subjected to increasingly warmer temperatures, which brings with it increased risk of wildfires and droughts, in turn impacting both air and water quality. And as Lorelei mentioned, sigma is an issue here with our water basins. Many of our county's residents rely on groundwater to serve their daily water needs, either through public water agencies or domestic well use. These public water agencies and private well owners have become subject to increasingly more stringent water quality standards in recent years, leaving agencies and homeowners with questions about health risk and treatment options. We know there are processes in place, just like Lorelei mentioned, such as CEQA, to ensure these issues are addressed for these new projects and industries, and that they're subject to review not just by agencies like public health, but the community as well. Given that background that I've just discussed, I'm going to have Newsha and Kimberley introduce themselves. But given that background, can you speak on what information or research is being done or is available to address these impacts from these new systems?
Happy to go first. Hi, everyone. First of all, it's very hard to follow Lorelei. It was really fun to watch and very informative, so I appreciate that. I'm Newsha Ajami. I'm the Chief Development Officer for Research at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. I'm a water expert by training. I've spent my entire life working on sustainable water resource management, and for a while I was a CCST fellow, so that should mention that as well. And I worked on both carbon and energy policy over the time I was working for the legislature. I think my task here was to focus on water, and I think a couple of things to mention. One is definitely the concerns that people have are valuable to pay attention to and notice. Partly, the research, there have been some research done to better understand potential impacts of carbon sequestration. Actually, my colleagues at Berkeley Lab have published a couple of reports and papers that sort of aggregate the sort of review papers that aggregates a lot of the knowledge that we have around potential short-term and long-term impact of CO2 sequestration. And what we have found is potentially this can be done quite safely, but there are sort of gaps and concerns that can be addressed if we do this a little bit better or we can do more research. A lot of these projects there are a lot of these research have been done in different locations, and as we have discussed, a lot of problems can happen in specific places, so understanding the geography and geology is quite important. And also it's important to kind of realize what are the different challenges every one of these geographies are sort of posing as we are doing more carbon sequestration. Also, the challenge is also timeline and scale. A lot of these tests have been done on a smaller scale. So the question is, if we want to get to the level of carbon capture that we all hope for, what happens as we start sequestering all this carbon? Also, Lorelei mentioned the challenge from the sort of upfront process, which is what it takes to capture the carbon and how much water do we need for that process, what kind of water do we need. also how you can potentially, what kind of infrastructure do we need to make sure we can provide resources to the people who work in this area. So, so it's kind of like a very complicated, but also important question to ask, because many communities that are actually prime for these kind of solutions are already dealing with some of the long-term consequences of other industries that have come in and have worked in their community and have left them with some of the unintended consequences that they have to deal with. So the question is quite valid and needs to be sort of addressed in different ways. And definitely, we have some knowledge, but we certainly need to expand on that and build more. And some of that will come from, I know we're going to get to this, but like, what kind of monitoring do we have in place? Who is monitoring? What kind of models are we using for this process? Sort of trying to understand these impacts through a more robust and information-based modeling and resource gathering is quite important.
Kimberley?
All right, aloha everybody. My name is Kim Mayfield. I'm a research scientist at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. My research is generally focused on the spectrum of carbon dioxide removal to energy equity and environmental justice concerns. I run the gambit anywhere in between those two topics. And what I am so grateful that Lorelei set the stage for here is PM 2.5. That is fine particulate matter. And just to center us all here, you know, World Health Organization, feel free to look it up, 5 micrograms per meter cubed is what they consider a nice, safe level. Please don't go above it. I looked it up today. Currently, as of about an hour ago, we were at 15.5 micrograms per meter cubed, so we're at about triple that today. So we've got a long way to go, because everybody deserves clean air to breathe. My first time that I ever actually visited Bakersfield, I was over in the northeast part of Bakersfield and went up into a building, and I was able to see all of the mountain range, and they said, oh, this is really rare, you know, appreciate this. And I go, why, it's right there. You should be able to see this all the time. And now I have learned that that actually was a really exceptional day in terms of air quality. Because those fine particles, they have human health impacts, they have haze impacts, and they are from a wealth of different sources. So about half of them here for Kern County are generally from on and off-road transit. So you're looking at things like heavy-duty trucking, cars, things like this. So California, we heard from the policy experts today all about what they're working on in the state in terms of carbon sequestration, but of course we've also all heard about how they're really pushing for electrification and vehicles that are not going to be emitting as much PM 2.5. But if you've ever been here in the summertime, wildfires make a difference. And so it was very nice to hear from the bikers team for the biomass carbon removal and storage about how they're going to be using some of that excess wood or fuel over in the Sierra Nevadas, and instead of letting that burn up and end up in our lungs, instead actually doing carbon removal with it, which I think is a really important piece of this puzzle. That one is expected to get worse, up to an additional 1.5 micrograms per meter cube for Kern County as climate change progresses. We then have crop burning. And I know that California recently made it illegal to burn crops out in the fields. I was in King City the other day for field work. It does still happen. Just want to make that really clear. It's still happening. So all of this outreach, I loved getting to hear from Charm about going out to farms and actually trying to meet people where they're at and pay for that agricultural waste. That was exciting to hear about. So it's been a really great interdisciplinary day today, and listening to all of the different impacts that these different technologies can have on PM 2.5 source reductions. So what I think is particularly exciting for carbon management is that we can do the reduce, reuse, recycle metaphor. Somebody said that earlier today, and I really enjoyed it. So we can reduce through decarbonization, We can reuse waste biomass and remove PM 2.5 from our air that way. But then also something particularly exciting is the monitoring of that reducing, reusing, and recycling. So what Lorelei was talking about with people selling the, we make no emissions, that's great. Would love numbers. Every single time that I'm trying to find numbers for, we're working on this road to removals report, and there's all of these really exciting new technologies in their infancy, and trying to get PM 2.5 emissions numbers. I mean, if people can make them more transparently available, I mean, we can work with that. It's great just to have data available, because sometimes people tell you on the side what type of PM 2.5 emissions reductions they're getting with their carbon capture technology, but going public, they don't want the target on their back. And I'm really hopeful that we can actually get these numbers out in the open and start working on making real models for what it would look like to live 10 miles away from a facility. You know, is it going to truly be emitting zero PM 2.5? Wonderful, love that. And that's what we want to get to. And that's what it sounds like everybody in this room here is really trying to get to. So, yeah, with that, I just think that I would like to see lots of monitoring, reporting, and verification when it comes to PM 2.5 in this carbon transition. I want everybody getting all their numbers. Thanks.
Newsha, did you have something else you wanted to say?
No, I think one thing that Kim said, which I think is quite important, and I brought it up and I want to reiterate that, is transparency is key to creating trust, and there's no way that we can be transparent unless we have a way to see the data and be able to work with the data. And it's very difficult to tell people, trust us, we are doing the right thing, when they can't really see what information you have and how you are monitoring and which one of those data points you are sharing, and what does that exactly mean to a community. So especially if these communities have been hurt before, it's very difficult for them to come from the point of mistrust to trusting different industries if they don't have the right data and they don't have the right information in front of them. So I think it's easy to say we are all scientists, we have done this many times, we know it's going to work out, trust us. And I know as a scientist, it's easy to say because my model is perfect, as you all know. But the reality is we all do all sort of modeling, and our model are as good as the code that we have written, the data we have put in it, and the parameters we have defined. And it can actually truly not be as good if we actually change things a little bit. So it's really important to be able to kind of run, know what the sort of admit some of the flaws that we have in our modeling capacity, and try to be able to capture some of the uncertainties and risks that are associated with this. I think Lorelei said something which I really appreciated, which is people like to know. You can, forever say things are going to work out, but if you are more honest and upfront, and if you say, I don't really know at scale how this thing is going to work, so I would like to try it, there's a little bit more open door for people to engage in the process versus sort of saying, it's going to work out, believe us. So I think this is key to make sure that robustness and transparency, robustness of the monitoring and verification process and transparency are key if we want to move this sector forward.
We have time for questions from the audience. One over here.
Thank you, doctors. It was said at another conference several months ago that the Central Valley is ground zero for climate change, and there's a little bit of an editorial before I ask the question, but the water quality and the air quality issues in the Central Valley, it's an existential threat. We have salt water coming in. That impacts all users of water throughout the state, and the air quality issues you elaborated on. what is the possibility, in your opinion, that when CCS is developed at scale here in the central part of California, it will be, you'll be able to directly point at CCS as being a catalyst for improving both water and air quality?
It will be a catalyst to improve air and water quality. Look, I think a couple of things that is very important to remember is we are moving slowly comparing to what everybody wants us, the speed we want everybody wants us to move, but partly is because there is a lot of interest to make sure we have all the right governance and regulatory processes in place to protect the communities as we are doing CCS from end to end, from capturing to sequestration. And I think that, and we are trying to kind of step back and be more proactive in our regulatory process and making sure we have stopgap measures in place versus being reactive, dealing with the impacts and potential liabilities in the future. So I think that's really important. Now, if we have the right measures in place, people can ask, when companies come in and they want to be involved in this process, they can actually engage with the community more proactively rather than, we'll let you know how this thing works, but actually having them at the table to see what their concerns are and trying to make sure those concerns are addressed by having the right set of sensing and monitoring put in place.
Forgive me, Doctor, I don't think I asked the question very well. I'll try again. Of course, the monitoring will have to be in place to make sure that CCS doesn't make matters worse. Of course, that is the case. Think 10 years down the road when we're sequestering 15 million metric tons per annum in California. Will it be possible, in your opinion, to evidence to other people that want to see California as a leader that it has worked to not only prevent problems with water and air quality, but it's actually improving water and air quality, the implementation of CCS?
I would say definitely that is possible to do in 10 years. You can, if you treat the Central Valley like a box model, or let's call it a bathtub, and we have tons of really exquisite models that will tell you all about how air circulates around the Central Valley. And if all the companies that do CCS projects are super honest about exactly what the PM 2.5 emissions were before CCS, and then we get to know what the numbers are after CCS, I know a handful of atmospheric modelers that would be more than happy to show you exactly in 10 years from now what the difference CCS made in terms of PM 2.5 concentrations in the air of the Central Valley. And we'll be able to see that difference.
And I just want to say also, remember the sequestration process, the injection doesn't happen in a shallow groundwater basin. It goes very, very deep. Some of the studies that have been done across the US and actually worldwide shows that a lot of this CO2 has a very limited impact in water quality, and some of the impacts that it might have can be mitigated through some of the treatment processes. Now, we hope if we manage our groundwater well, we are not going to need to go that deep to that level of groundwater basin, but the groundwater aquifers. But you never know, and we may need that water as well as a water source in 10 years, 15 years. But if it's done well, potentially it cannot have permanent impact on water quality that we might not be able to treat and handle.
Any other questions?
So I know there's some great modeling and good research, but are there other regions, perhaps in the country, I wouldn't imagine the state, but the country or even the world, who are actually implementing this level of transparency and engaging with their communities so that we don't have to recreate the wheel?
I know some of the Scandinavian countries have been doing sequestration for a long time, and I am not 100% sure I know all the details about the transparency process, but I think this is definitely a possibility. And I know often when I bring this up, people say, it's very costly, it's not easy, it's a long process. A lot of people need to agree on it. And I would say if we really want to move this forward, if we want to move this needle toward the positive side, we really should be willing to put the time and the money and the resources to make sure we are doing this right. And again, I want to reiterate this. The point is we don't want to have we want to have no regret options. We do not really want to go back 50 years and say, you know, we did this wrong, and we have people with no water or with no good air quality or actually pollution all over the place because we didn't anticipate these. And the reality is a lot of us really do know the flaws or the unknowns in our work. It's just a matter of being quite forward and transparent with them. And I think we can do that research. But the question is, are we willing to put our resources and the time to do that?
And I think one other thing I would add is that we actually have a colleague from our group who's missing today, but the reason why is because they're with a DOE and carbon capture company that's actually testing at a carbon capture facility, looking at those co-pollutants and what their CCS does and getting numbers on the books. So people are listening, including the Department of Energy. They do want these numbers out there on the books, and so there's at least one company who's doing that this week.
One last thing also I would say is the key word here is scale. I think we should keep that in mind because a lot of these tests and work that has been done has not been done in scale. So we really have a hard time right now convincing people that when it's done in scale, it will be done right. So that's one of the important points that we have to keep in mind. That's why also monitoring and verification is important, because as you scale, you can actually catch yourself if you are going to, you're making mistakes or you're having issues. So.
Any other questions from the audience?
Thank you. Dr. Mayfield, here in the San Joaquin Valley, we're at extreme non-attainment for ozone. And I was just wondering if you had any comment in regards to ozone and CCS, or if there's any possible future correlation between the two.
I'm going to be the first to admit that I am not an ozone expert here. Apologies. And I don't like to pull answers out of the air. So I'm going to say that my honest answer is I do not know. I came prepared for PM 2.5, but you're welcome to take my email, and I would be happy to look into it for you. Apologies.
Any final questions? All right, before we wrap, Dr. Mayfield, Dr. Ajami, any closing thoughts that you'd like to share with the group?
Go ahead, Kim.
Sure. My closing thought is let's go ahead and get some robust MRV for carbon and for environmental impacts. I'm excited for both.
Yeah, I think that is a great closing statement. I think the key is to be able to put some good regulatory and governance structures in place to make sure we can track our steps and we know what impacts we are having. And maybe to add to that, I would also say it is important to have everybody at the table as we are making these decisions. I know often people are concerned that community groups are resisting towards some of these solutions just because they don't understand the concepts or the science or the issues that are being offered to them. But the reality is they are a very important voice in this process, and they can ask very important questions that we might not have looked into it in our scientific inquiries. Before I joined the lab, I ran a research program at Stanford for 10 years, and our focus was all about place-based, bottom-up, impact-focused research, which is all about understanding what people's concerns are, what questions they're asking, and then figuring out how we can build, you know, a state-of-the-art knowledge that can inform that process. And I think we can do that with this process. We just need to have the willingness to listen and pay attention and engage. So I think on top of the MRV and a robust process, I think we need to make sure we have a right process of engaging different groups and communities in this process.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mayfield and Dr. Ajami.